So much of this negative team's case is contingent on believing that the US will pull out. Two reasons that you should immediately discredit this claim. The first is that they explain why the kind of natural resources that exist in Africa, things like lithium mines, are essential to the kind of products that the US makes. Do you like iPhones? I think most people like phones. If that's true, obviously the US has an incentive to continue to invest there. But secondly, I think you should look historically, which is that when the Cold War happened, there was a huge amount of competition between the US and the Soviet Union for the cooperation of African states. The reason for that is they have ideological incentives to make sure that things like communism or the kind of political structure of China and Russia don't grow, which is why even if you don't think that they are economically reliant, they have the kind of ideological incentives to make sure that they continue to cooperate, to continue to invest. And I think that observation is damning for this negative team, because at the point at which we can prove that the US continues to engage, we co-opt all of their big economic benefits. The difference though, and the delta in this debate, is that we give African countries two things. Firstly, we give them the choice and the ability to choose which system they opt into. Because right now, they are hamstrung and shackled into a system of pegging their dollars to the US dollar, of taking dodgy loans from the IMF with incredibly harsh conditions, and have no other alternative. But secondly, that even if they want to continue to invest with the US, that is a choice they're making freely. We say that is a good and a principled win. Two questions to win this debate. Firstly, why this makes South Africa a stronger economic actor and why that leads to enormous benefits for the continent. And secondly, why we drastically improve the economic and diplomatic circumstances of Africa. I'm firstly, though, going to start with why South Africa becomes an economic actor. And there are two reasons why this should be the most essential claim in this debate in the way that you judge it. First, is because when South Africa becomes a stronger economic actor, they are forced to do things like build infrastructure that is like roads from the bottom of the continent to the top, that is like ports which exist at different strategic points. This is infrastructure that every country can use. But crucially, even if you don't believe that other countries are going to use the specific ports, the ports open up different kinds of foreign domestic investment which is able to access different countries. Because it is just structurally true that South Africa doesn't have every kind of natural resource available. The kind of geographical circumstances of Africa means that different things are deposited in different places. But now that there is a port in South Africa, different companies are able to use that and are able to co-opt the resources and the roads that exist to go into other countries. But secondly, even if you don't believe that they can use the materials and infrastructure that South Africa brings, you should believe that South Africa is incentivized to strengthen its neighbors. And I think the reason why this is true is incredibly intuitive, because a stronger region just leads to greater geopolitical security. Imagine the kind of power Africa would have in places like the UN or the World Bank if they were economically powerful. I think to any average reasonable voter, that is in South Africa's interests. Having stronger neighbors directly benefits them on any international stage. But secondly, I just think it stimulates FDI, which is important for South Africa. All of that is to say that benefiting South Africa benefits the region. If we can prove that we benefit South Africa, we must necessarily win this debate. Why do we improve South Africa? We give you a set of reasons at Zoe as to why this makes it stronger, which have received little to no response. Firstly, we say the fact that you are a member of this bloc increases trade and infrastructure. Why? Because just because you're a member, you are able to do things like have FTAs which reduce tariffs between countries like India and China. These are huge exporters and huge importers, and crucially do things like want the lithium mines that exist within these countries, and so produce huge amounts of infrastructure there. The benefit of that is just A, more trade, but B, I think just think about the kinds of, the huge amounts of money that is now circulating within that economy. I think it is incredibly intuitive to understand why money is circulating in an economy leads to huge economic benefits. I think it leads to a happier population, which leads to greater productivity. I think it allows you to invest in different kinds of public infrastructure like education, which makes people more able to go to school. And so even if you believe that this kind of money only circulates in South Africa, that is still an intense good, because more people being educated in South Africa leads to a stronger union in and of itself. Secondly though, we explain that de-dollarization is an enormous good for South Africa. Why? Because the economic stability of the US is decreasing. I'm just going to explain what's happening. The US has hit a debt ceiling, right? They have so many loans they cannot pay back. They are left with the choice of one clear option, which is de-dollarizing, which means they devalue the weight of the US dollar. That is incredibly harmful to every other global economy that is reliant on that USD having value. At the point at which we encourage South Africa to de-dollarize, that is enormous good. Why do we encourage South Africa to de-dollarize? Firstly, because that is literally the aim of BRICS, and the reason you should believe that is that China is a member and Russia is a member of BRICS, and they themselves have economically distanced themselves from the United States. Thirdly though, we explain that South Africa now achieves more soft power. Why is that true? Because they are able to align themselves with strong diplomatic actors like Russia and China, who literally hold so many seats in the Security Council, for example, and who are now able to veto things which are diplomatically harmful for South Africa, whether it be sanctions, whether it be whatever. What does this negative team say in response? They say, This is literally it, check your notes. These benefits won't trickle down to other African countries. I think, again, you should immediately discredit this argument, because even if it is true that the money doesn't circulate from the specific South African border across the border, there are benefits within South Africa which is helpful for everyone. The kind of infrastructure that they have, better education, but also I do not believe that you should believe that there is kind of no economic circulation. Obviously people migrate within Africa, obviously people just go on holidays and have movement. I think you should believe that this money circulates beyond that. So, at the end of this issue, you know that South Africa is a stronger economic actor, you know that has an enormous benefit for the South African region. We win this today. But we win it a second time over because we prove that we drastically increased the economic and diplomatic circumstances of Africa as a whole. We explained that other African nations are likely to join BRICS with the South African membership. They say we can't fiat this. Obviously they missed the 3 elegant reasons we give you at Zoe as to why they are likely to join. Firstly, because it is in South Africa's interest to lobby BRICS to allow other states to join. That's because having safe and strong economic neighbors is beneficial. But secondly, it's because it sends a clear message to BRICS that African states and nations are incredibly important resources. They have mineral deposits and raw materials which are necessary in order to survive. But thirdly, I think you should immediately believe that African countries want to join BRICS because they do things like take incredibly predatory loans from the IMF and OBOR. They are desperate for some economic activity, desperate for some diplomatic involvement. You should immediately believe that African states are more likely to join BRICS. And that is devastating for this negative team, because we can ultimately replicate all of the reasons why South Africa becomes a stronger economic actor, copy and paste that into why other African states are now more able to be economically viable. They say that competition with the US is good. We explain that competition with the US is good. They say the US won't no longer compete, they'll go elsewhere. At the beginning of this speech, I prove why that is untrue. Firstly, because these states have economic value. They have lithium mines that are essential for the functioning of the US economy and just society at large. But secondly, they have political incentives to make sure that they continue to exist. But even if it is true that they leave the West, I still think we win this debate. And the reason for that is that the West is historically a terrible economic actor within Africa. Any average reasonable person knows about the intense plunder and manipulation that has existed on the continent. They have no incentive to do things well. They have every incentive to take what they can. They have no real investment in the region. So even if it is true that we reduce the economic power of the US to get involved in these countries, I think that is fine, because I think China is an incredibly strong economic actor. I think any average reasonable person reads that in headlines, they can cough the slack. But even if they don't join the union, we describe a number of benefits that still win us this debate. How do they respond? They say a counterfactual of regional FTAs and trading blocs will meet the gap. Obviously, those aren't mutually exclusive to their side at all. I think that any reason they give as to why countries are incentivized to make regional voting blocs, copy and paste it exists under our side. Secondly, they say that there are diplomatic and democratic harms by posturing towards China. So unclear to me as to why. Like, as long as you aren't becoming communist, it's not immediately obvious to me why the US freaks out. But even if the US freaks out, I still think you should believe that there's not a huge harm, because the kind of diplomatic power that the US has is ultimately counteracted by China and Russia, who these countries are now aligned with. We create a stronger South Africa, we create a better Africa, we win this debate.
I think we need to understand that the actor of this motion is what those other African countries. They claim that there's going to be agency for other African countries if we can join BRICS freely, right? But I think US also gives those kinds of agency, because remember that they offer help and investments. So the way in here is that you need to give more guarantee that you'll be able to opt in on the rest of the house. Because likelihood is that US wants the whole population for demands from like all those 25 countries, but on the rest of the house, their only benefit is they have the contingency of South African countries being able to give towards those other countries. There's no likelihood on why they would do that. There's no incentive for why those kinds of organizations have like really good likelihood for them to like have those kinds of relations under their side of the house. Jumping to Rebuttal. But before that, I want to talk about what is South African or like other African countries' interests, right? We agree on one, they have economic interests, they want to be better. But secondly, in a way, I think they do want to have a democratization to happen, because again, they have organizations like AFTA, for example, to make sure that they have like a good democratic leader. But secondly, they want the Republic of Congo to have like a really good democracy. That's why they want help from US, for example, to make sure they can maintain this kind of democracy. So I think those kinds of things will be important later on. But first off, then, they want to talk about BRICS are good because they can have infrastructure investment, etc. in South Africa. One, I think investment from China is not the best. I think I fucked up Sri Lanka where their land was taken due to debtors that already happened. But secondly, I think China has already exploited Africa when they invest in roads and airports that were never used. Because the purpose of that is just to give them a lot of money for them to actually like use and invest in something that they don't know what to do. That's why they build roads and highways and certain like train routes, for example. And at the end, because they couldn't pay off all this kind of investment, that's why like China has the ability to take off certain lands from those kinds of African countries. The comparison is, sure, IMF is not the best, but I think the firm is quite marginal on the outside of the house. Because the requirement makes sense. Once you want to pay some, once you want to land a debt, for example, they ask you, but this is the things that you need to do, for example. So it's far, like the accountability and the check and balance is far easier for under outside the house in comparison to certain countries in like those kinds of BRICS where like they don't necessarily tell you what to do. They just give you a bunch of investment, and if you cannot do it, then you're fucked up. That's why under the rest of the house, it's far harder for you to gain certain accountability and check and balances. Where under outside the house, sure, IMF is not the best, but it's still quite marginal on those kinds of harms. And also, I think other countries also have the incentive to help you. For example, like how Indonesia have a lot of debt, but Malaysia and Thailand helps us, for example, to pay off those kinds of debts. The reason why under their subject is less likely to do that because A, the investment coming from BRICS or like China, I guess, like is significantly substantially huge. That's why it's harder for other countries to help you. But secondly, I think because you're an ally towards them, other like democratic elected like countries are less likely to help you because they don't see you as like an ally, for example. So it's far harder for you to gain more allies or to gain more countries to help you under your side of the house, which is very, very dangerous because once you don't have other countries' relations to help you, you also don't have economic trade under your side of the house, and you presumably only have China and Russia to rely on. And that's also a harm that they also concede on if they say, oh, US is the only thing that you rely on, right? But second thing, they say that trading is good under the side of the house, and like you can trade willingly with other African countries and China, etc. One, if you trade with China, it's going to be quite cheap, or like your benefit is not going to be huge, because they have much more other countries like Southeast Asian nations who also have the same resources and same minerals that you are going to trade to. So presumably you don't have much bargaining power anyways. But secondly, I think they respond that if people can benefit from South Africa emerging to greatness because of infrastructure. Infrastructure doesn't move anywhere. Personally, it's going to stay in South Africa. So like it's not there. Those kinds of economic progress are going to stay in Africa. Most likely that they could do is that a lot of African country citizens are going to South Africa, which also like increase those kinds of population like boost under their side, which harms the economy under their side because they don't have like for example infrastructure to like accommodate every single people in African countries. So even if they have economic boost, it's going to be far larger harms under their side when you only like centralize it in one African country, right? Secondly then, let's talk about secondary on what the United States will do. One, their first net claim that US will step in and push infrastructures, right? One, that's not true. We flip this and say they will invest in other African countries such as South Africa, for example. Or for example, like they will invest in other developing nations to like combat against those kinds of people who became allied towards BRICS, for example. Which is why it's not going to like give more investment towards like African countries because they view those kinds of countries as like not going to be like progressive, for example, or like not going to be cooperative with our like political discussion, for example. And secondly, again, because they're less democratic. But I think the incentive for other countries to invest under their standards will also be less because one, BRICS are countries that don't attract investors. The international reputation of Russia and China is bad because Russia has the Ukraine war. A lot of countries really hate Russia now, and China also has certain conflict with Taiwan, for example. So a lot of Southeast Asian nations don't like China as well. So they are more likely to be volatile under your side of the house. They are less likely to try to invest under your side of the house. Exactly, you only are dependent on BRICS in your side if you want to have economic trading under your side. Second, West countries, sure they might be a bit evil in some cases, but they also have a lot of allies. They will not want to invest in you because you are seen as less democratic, or you're not as simply seen as neutral anymore. You're seen as having a side that you wanted to like focus on, right? Lastly, I think your power in international market or international discussion will be less because your influence is presumably going towards more of the BRICS nation, which is presumably again not going to be the best. Okay, moving on. So why could US be good under our side of the house? One, I think US have far more accountability rather than BRICS because again, there's going to be a lot of past precedents, right? We know they fucked up in a lot of things, which is why we have far easier for them to have check and balances and try to like rebuild against them, saying that don't you like messed up again, for example, or like a lot of international actors that could actually like demonize those kinds of US actors, or like how Joe Biden doesn't want the exact same thing happening to Donald Trump, for example. They want to change those kinds of like presidential election. But secondly, there's a lot of check and balances as well from other international actors that are holding US accountable because again, even if US like have messed up a lot of times, they have the EU, for example, who condemn the US. They have a lot of like nations or organizations that also like try to like make sure that US could be accountable. But the comparison is, it's far more harder to have check and balances towards these BRICS BRICS nation, because they are like one huge nation that doesn't really listen to anyone. They are really independent and they don't really join a lot of organization, and if they do, they only join like on really powerful stage, while South Africa is still quite small and we can still like, it's still quite middle, so their bargaining power in those states are still quite hard for them to actually like ask them, actually we don't want this, we deny this, they cannot do that under their side of the house. But again, I think the reason why US could be good to us is that South Africa is a key element to invest in, right? It is very close to China or like the Asia as a whole, so they make sure that Africa is a really strategic geographical place for them to actually like invest in, because they can have more influence on like the other Asian sea, for example. So they don't want to mess up on that again. They do want to have more incentive to invest on their side of the our side of the house. But second, I posted that they also want to benefit from this kind of investment, right? Because again, they want resources. They also like love that. But secondly, they want to like influence on the democratic sphere and like make sure a lot of more countries are more influenced for that. And lastly, there's going to be past retribution to give back to African countries, for example, for the reasons of like apartheid and etc. I think they also have the incentive to do that. So the weighing here is that one, the interest to cooperate with BRICS. I think due to the relation with other countries not good, we don't want to invest, right? Even if on the BRICS case, like, oh sure, there's a lot of economic boost under their side of the house, I think it's okay to trade off that for better economic trade, because one, the benefit is quite marginal. We also get economic boost on our side of the house. But second, I think the long-term impact on our side is far better, because on their side, there's a chance for you to be controlled, for example, from the BRICS nation, because they are far stronger than you, and you don't have much influence and bargaining power on them. While on US, for example, on the West, even if they do certain things that you don't like, there's still a lot of like social justice warrior that can like fight for you, for example, or for your country. So it's far easier for you to gain certain independence, for example, if they do something bad. So on the way, it's far easier for us to gain like more benefits or like economic trade from US, or like it's far easier for them to invest in all the African countries, because that is the active motion that we want to protect. For all those reasons, Nikki.
I think it's so incredibly important to note how the incredible number of tensions that we see in the negative team's case. They tell us that African nations are not desirable. They tell us that China will not pay very much for these goods. They tell us that African nations aren't important enough to ever include them in this incredibly important economic regional bloc. But then they also tell us that the US loves Africa, that the US highly values Africa, that the US highly compensates Africa and compensates them fairly and accurately for everything that they get. If that was true, Africa obviously would be incredibly rich. Africa would not be poor. We would not have all of the problems that you currently see and all of the problems that necessitate BRICS. So for this, 3 issues in this speech. First off, on how we still manage to get, first off on the incentives of the US, secondly why Russia and China are a far better actor, and then thirdly on why African countries can without a doubt still join BRICS, noting the shocking lack of response that we've had to all of this material. So first off on the incentives of the US, I think it's important to note how rapidly changing their characterization of the US continually is. They say that they have fucked up in the past, and they say that that's going to be okay going forward to the present. I don't think any of this really stands at the end. So first off, they tell us that the US has interest in the African region. Yes, I think this actually counteracting all of that BRICS material regarding why other countries wouldn't have like incentives to invest within Africa. They obviously do, and it's far better that they do. But note also that the US has a unique incentive that is distinct from that of China and Russia to exploit Africa, because at present they do not think that Africa is ever going to be taken away from them. They do not think that there is anyone that is going to court Africa and give them a better offer, and it is far better for them as a manufacturing nation that is so focused on technology that Africa stays down and only focuses on the resources part, that they never gain money and they never rise up. Comparatively, China and Russia, as we told you down the bench, do, because they want to strengthen the BRICS nation. It looks better for them if all of their friends are quite powerful, and so they have incentives to uplift them instead. In terms of this idea that US is a better actor, what do we hear here? A couple of things. We hear generally that their politics are a little bit better, that China has been a little bit fishy, and that, you know, like Biden is perhaps a little bit of a better person than Xi Jinping. First off, note that the US is not Africa. Like, US absolutely hates Africa, and there have been so many tensions within this relationship, uniquely, that do not apply to the Africa-China relationship. What does that mean? Literally things like colonization, for example, between the west of Africa. This means like an interest in like exploiting these like raw materials, so on and so forth. I think in terms of this idea that Asian regions can like quite easily like replace African regions, note first off that we've told you that there are unique mineral resources within Africa, like lithium, like cobalt mines, so on and so forth, that are so incredibly essential that means that they are not replaceable in this unique way, and there is thus incentive to exploit them. Okay, then why will the US not go? Okay, what else do we hear here? We also hear that the US thinks that South Africa is very useful. You want to keep us an ally and treat well. Evidently that is still not, because they're still poor, they're still taking advantage of. And then finally, in terms of this last ditch idea that we get in like the dying minutes of this second named speech that US social justice warriors will fight for you if the US messes up. Obviously that is just not true whatsoever. I don't think Twitter warriors have any power whatsoever. But even if this is true, note that there are so many reasons why they are unable to be kept in check. That is the fact that the US has massive amounts of power. That is the fact that the US literally controls all of the major international organizations like the WTO and the IMF. That is the fact that the US has direct political incentives to try and take down other nations because they want to be the most powerful country ever, and that means politically and economically they have shown in the past that they are willing to ruin other countries. For example, the fact that they are literally sanctioning Iran to the point where people are literally starving. They do not have any humanitarian incentives whatsoever. Note at the end of this, no actor is completely perfect, but the best way to keep powerful countries in check is by making them compete for you. So then, finally, why will the US not go away at the end of this, even if China comes in? First off, note that in terms of this idea of not trading with undemocratic nations, the US historically has and will continue to if it is important enough. For example, the US still, within the Ukraine-Russian invasion and the Ukraine-Russian war, whatever, is still trading with Russia, and even if they say they have some sanctions, the reality is they're, for example, still trading things like enriched uranium with Russia because they still really, really need it. They still have economic interests, they can still have trade and relationships, and in fact, the more powerful Africa and South Africa grow, there is more incentive to trade with them even more in order to secure alliances politically as well. Okay. And then finally, in terms of the idea of Western allies, obviously Western allies are literally just the West. West is still allied with India and so on and so forth, and other countries within the BRICS. I don't think this really stands. Then on the competing incentives of Russia and China, I think this just generally aligns a lot more. First off, note that they have huge amounts of capacity to invest in this region. For example, China and India are notably rich countries. They also have a lot of firms that are willing to invest more within this technology region, especially if it is a country like South Africa that can fill in that missing gap of unique resources. Note also that they have those incentives to invest in terms of strengthening the BRICS bloc in order to be able to do more things. For example, they need a lot more political capital, and that political capital is gained through more countries being more powerful and supporting them in order to do things like de-dollarization, so on and so forth. Furthermore, they have that general strong ideological incentive to try and build up a strong alliance against Western countries and break out of that label of appearing like the villain. In terms of that idea that China will not pay much for African goods, first off, again, note that these are unique goods. There is literally no other alternative. Southeast Asian countries are focused on manufacturing. Their comparative advantage is in labor. This is incredibly different, and demand is currently incredibly high. Demand increases exponentially once you get competition and competition for these sorts of things. So, in terms of this idea that the BRI is bad, and that is a reason why we should condemn China completely, first off, note that only occurred in the past when South Africa was not within this sort of relationship, and when there was not very much chance at all of Africa joining these sorts of things. And also, note that China has direct incentives to be anti-imperialist in order to try and attract other countries away from the US. One lone country cannot pose as one giant global power. They need allies, so thus it is incredibly favorable. And note that this changes at the point in which BRICS grows a lot more powerful and all of these sorts of things. In terms of that idea of not having any checking mechanisms against China, for example, I think all of their stuff regarding they have fucked up in the past, and thus this means that they will do better going forward, or people will look out going forward, that they use for the US, similarly apply to China. In fact, I think if that mechanism actually works, it works even better for China, because if you have been burned by one person, you are highly unlikely to trust them wholeheartedly and go into it again. I think this means a far better relationship springs up. Then finally, in terms of how African countries join BRICS, note that we have received absolutely no response, so all of our material from first still stands at this. Okay, they told us that these are small countries and poor, and so this means nobody wants you to be within the region. First off, note that you still need someone in order to fill that gap, and having more countries within any sort of international organization strengthens it immediately, because this means that a lot of these countries have voting powers within other international organizations, a lot of small things build up to a big thing. But apart from that, note that you only need a couple countries to join in order to be able to amass massive benefits to the region. That is to say that once your neighboring country is a lot richer, that means they set up infrastructures that you can also take advantage of. That means that your labor capacities, for example, the people within your region can travel over and work within that region and send money back, and all those sorts of things. In terms of this idea that alternative and regional FTAs can completely a substitute for this, first off, note that this is not mutually exclusive. In fact, I think South Africa has multiple incentives to develop this region. This is to say that it is a small country by itself, and it is strengthened by uniting with its neighbors, which means that there are already many of these FTAs in place. They quite clearly have not worked whatsoever. But note also Regional alliances are better strengthened by these sorts of things. That is to say that like if you have a lot more economic like development in the region, that benefits absolutely everyone. But note also, regional like FTAs are alone insufficient. That is to say that the comparative advantage of the entire African region is quite similar to all of the countries, within there. That is to say that they all have a lot of minerals and all have a lot of resources. They do not have the similar manufacturing capacities. They do not have those companies that are willing to invest. They do not have the instructions and the IP to be able to make all of those things that actually economically enrich you as a country. So incredibly proud to propose.
When the brightest of your friend group leaves the group chat and is recruited by the elites of the school, you stop being the beneficiary of the teacher's pet. Because you're not going to have a trickle-down effect, you're being replaced. Before I go to discussing why we have more inclusive policies in our side, I'll address two concerns that I think is the foundation of AFCASE. Number one, is the benefit for South Africa a benefit for Africa as a whole? And number two, why will the US leave in your side? Number one, why is the benefit for South Africa not a benefit for Africa as a whole? There are 4 reasons why. Number one, there's been literally zero proof on why South Africa would want to do trickle-down effect insofar as states in Africa are often formed by things like ethnic tension and like general ideological difference in the past. And therefore, insofar as even neighboring countries are probably still having tension with one another, it's unclear to me why they would want to remove all those ideological barriers and therefore share all their resources and be developed together singing Kumbaya. Number two, South Africa largely focuses on BRICS in your side, who are much more important and who is much more strategic to do the same thing. Because we told you the problem is comparative advantage here, right? Because what is offered by Africa as a whole is an explosive population growth. It can be a really good market. You can share, like laborers and stuff like that. But it's also the same thing that is being offered by China, Russia, and India, and Brazil, the 4 of the probably largest population in the world. And insofar as you can trade, you can, make China and India your market, you're less likely to want to cooperate with other African states who are way more underdeveloped and still has a long way to go. But thirdly, we told you that you probably don't want competition with your neighboring states, right? Because what they presumably this means that you are much more likely to make your own country the strongest of Africa, like it factually already is. But then you're going to double down on that particular promise, because the premise that we get from AF is that better regional bloc power means that you have more power in the World Bank. But they achieved the exact same thing in an easier way with BRICS rather than developing a brand new collaboration, for example, with the rest of the African Union. So one state can only be effectively a part of one regional bloc for that exact reason, because you don't know who to prioritize. And I think a rational South Africa would be likely to prioritize China and India and Russia as opposed to other African states. The implication is simple, because South Africa will be much more powerful and will be the only hub connecting Africa to the world, i.e. all other exports will have to, go through South African port. They claim that it's a benefit. We think it's probably not a benefit insofar as South Africa will be benefited from things like taxation and customs from other African states, that you don't have independent relationship with another, like even Western allies or Asian allies, insofar as Asian allies only see South Africa as the most important state in Africa. But lastly, the blunder for third affirmative is to concede that the resources in African Union are largely similar. It then sounds to me like a lot of countries would probably just trade with South Africa if they offer similar resources anyway. But that's also quite a tension with second half, saying that they're probably offering different resources as well. But no matter what you buy, I think what we told you was that more likely South Africa will be much more prominent, will be seen as the face of Africa, that other African states are not likely to be heard in your side. Of course, for the argument to run, I need to prove why the US will leave. 4 reasons why. Number 1, the claim, the claim that we get from AF was that US is not likely to leave. US is more likely to give and invest with more capital. Number 1, it's very difficult for the US and the struggling Western states to give cheaper loans and to burn more money than Chinese long-term established plan of BRI that is established by Xi Jinping. Insofar as Xi Jinping is probably they don't have any democratic opposition, as opposed to the democratic system in the West that keeps on currently changing, so they cannot develop such a long-term plan. They can burn money and wish for any profit in the future. You're more likely to be gate-capped by China and also the strongest particular neighbor that you have being South Africa, that you ought not cooperate with the US, you ought to cooperate with us. Secondly, the economic reason that they claim, i.e. US wants lithium oil, I think what you need to understand is US operates on discovering untapped market as opposed to entering already revealed market, i.e. Middle East, Asia, and Africa. In the past, US found those resources and US capitalized on it. This is because they're excellent in finding new resources, i.e. lithium factories developing in Southeast Asia and new sources of oil in Arctic and Alaska, which we didn't know existed before. We thought oil only existed in the Middle East, and therefore US has the capacity to develop to other regions. They're more likely to opt out of your area that's already been gatekept by China and Russia to enter other regions, so that's not probably a benefit for you. Thirdly, I think what happens in their side is, even if I were to consider that US will probably not leave entirely, but there's still some agency for states to interact with US, what happens is some countries adopting BRICS and some chooses US. Forgive my like less good English than them, but this is important. This means more tension, more military bases, and the African Union Free Trade Area falls. Why? Importantly, this is why BRICS are also unlikely to allow US or its allies to opt in, i.e. by making more predatory loans to kick out competition. Because if two neighboring countries pick different alliances, i.e. one state choosing US and the other state choosing BRICS, that means that less continuation of Chinese BRI, because Chinese BRI and infrastructure operates like railroads, like all connecting the states. And insofar as China wants to lock out US completely, that's what happens. But even if you still consider US participation, it is exactly in second half's arguments of ideological reason that might suggest that it might not be a benefit in a continent already filled with ethnic tension to be added with more tension of US and China. Crucially, this worsens things like neighboring states tension, even if and especially if US does not leave, because US would want to maintain their hegemony. China and BRICS also does the same thing, and your area will be just another victim of their proxy war. But lastly and importantly, another blunder from their side was the last ditch defense to say that US hates Africa. But it sounds to me like in their case also false, because their benefit is to say that US will give more investment, and it sounds to me like if the US hates Africa, presumably they will leave if Africa is already occupied by another union. So, but either way, no matter which characterization of US you buy in their side, we still win, insofar as we prove to you that the US will be much more likely to invest in your side in Africa in net. Next up, I'm going to talk about inclusion, and I want to weigh this and compare it to why US inclusion is better. Number one, factually, BRICS is of limited membership, i.e. of 5 emerging economies that are close to new members that are way less emerging, as we claimed from first neg. Notably, other African states means that all or at least most of African states as per the motion, and therefore allowing only Nigeria to join BRICS is probably not a benefit for all other African states that is the primary actor in this debate. Second, even if you can join, there's absolutely no incentive for BRICS to expand to include every African state. Number one, we push that BRICS is a collaboration between themselves, and they are unlikely to want to engage to the African Continental Free Trade Area anymore because of things like similar products, as they conceded, and comparative advantage. But secondly, more on the point of comparative advantage is also crucial, because BRICS are emerging economies with the biggest population in the world. African states are on the comparative strategic also because they have explosive population growth. So it's very convenient for them to just claim tension in neg. Because the problem is not tension, the problem is US and the West probably prefers Africa because they need the market. Western countries are facing like large population degrowth, and therefore they need to find the market from Africa that will otherwise not be utilized by China in their side. So when they try to argue that, but they can choose because IMF gives much more requirement. Number one, IMF, WTO, and stuff like that realize that most of their money providers are developing states, so they have the natural incentive to develop friendly requirement as existed factually. But secondly, these are the necessary requirements to prevent the loan from being misused. Because note the counterfactual here. China, and this is where the flip to their mechanism of having democratic option is crucial. In fact, I would argue that they did have the choice in the past, and they did choose China and their $153 billion loan that leads to things like massive debt crisis, making their area a proxy base for Chinese military zone that they use as land as a battleground for just their gains. What we told you was that democratic option is only good insofar as both options are equally as good. What we failed to hear from that side of the house is why China and BRICS are a better option. What we claim was that US will tend to you more, but they unfortunately will be locked out because of the hegemony and gatekeeping in their side. Okay.